Welcome back, ladies and gents. I hope you're all keeping well. So, today I want to chat a little bit about democracy. And don't worry, it's not going to be a rhetorical video. I'm not here to sell democracy to anybody. I don't really feel like that's necessary for the vast majority of people. We are starting to see a small percentage of people, though, who have just decided that it's all gone to the dogs and we need something else now. And these generally come in two categories, I find. There's the general public who are just dog tired of all this political circus. There's all these charlatans running around and nobody's saying anything. They open their mouth and they'll talk all day and there's nothing coming out, nothing of substance. So we've people who are just tired of that. And they reckon, look, if somebody knows what to do, I'm happy to just let them be in power and let them run the country. And the second group are basically, some of them are just maniacs who want power, but a lot of them are people who they know what's right and they know what's good for the country and they've watched their governments fuck that up royally. And basically, they want unopposed power to set things right. But of course, the problem with that is sometimes being right is based on the perspective you're looking at something through. Things can be looked at from different angles, and right can become very subjective and flexible. And the thing is, I do believe, like I was talking about in the last video I did, that this is one of those things where they're agitating to get a result they want. Because the whole thing is, if you start looking at systems in terms of which is the easiest to infiltrate and which has dispersed the power most widely, then that's where it really highlights that democracy is the best system in terms of it is the hardest to manipulate. Now, just because it's been manipulated, people will point and say that I'm wrong on that. But the more concentrated the power, the higher risk we are of it falling into the wrong hands and it being too much power. And on the subject of democracy having been manipulated, like I'd ask people to appreciate the fact of the amount of infrastructure that was required to make that possible. They had to monopolize the entire of the mainstream media. They infiltrated education. They made celebs their little talking point puppets. We've got all these, quote unquote doctors who don't seem to know their arse from their elbow, to be perfectly honest about it. I feel like I could state without a doubt that we are in the middle of the single largest mass manipulation program that's ever taken place in history. And you could argue that this was all necessary because of democracy. Because had the power been concentrated a smaller way, it might have been easier to infiltrate, it might have been easier to manipulate, it might have been easier to threaten. People forget there's weak people everywhere and everyone can be got to if they're not bought, silver or lead, as they say. So, obviously, the point being that the more people you have to get to, the less likely that you will get to all of them and it still remains secret. And not only that, but you have to get to these people and assume that they can win over the public with your help. Now, to me, this just means we have work to do. It doesn't mean we decide to adapt a different system that consolidates power and makes it easier for us to somehow end up in this boat again someday. And as I've said before, if we adopt the chess analogy, then there's a very good chance that this is a reactive move that our enemy ultimately wants. So, myself, I remember years ago, I can't remember whether it was the Lisbon Treaty or the Nice Treaty, but I remember one of them was a treaty of amendments to other treaties. It was one of those, it was impossible to consume as a standalone document. You had to go rooting through dozens of other treaties. We were never going to know what was really happening. And at the time, I remember thinking to myself, this is mental. This is no way to hold a referendum. We had no real way of knowing what was going on. And, we just got snippets and a synopsis from the media, and we all know how that works. They're just going to peddle what they want from us. So I think for myself, that's probably where I started to think that democracy needs a lot of work. I remember at the time that the idea I had was to create like an online theory test for the referendum. The idea behind it being that you would have to prove that you understood the implications of what you were voting on. But I quickly realised that that's not really workable because, in a sense, you're putting an intellectual barrier on the right to vote. Because people have aptitude, for a lot of people, politics and political philosophy, economics, these just aren't their things, and you don't deserve to be punished because you weren't born with a certain aptitude. So, although this could still prove to be a great informative tool before referendums and the public can use it or, not use it if that's their choice, I don't think it should become an imposition. But this was good because it led me to a change in perspective when I realized that I'm not saying there should be no imposition on the population whatsoever, but I realized that any imposition should be on the few and not the many. Any would be politicians or candidates, etc., anyone like that who wants to govern, the imposition should be on them, not the general public. Really, what I'm saying here is that if we control the quality of the politicians that we have the option to vote for, I mean, then there's no way for us to not end up with a better choice of leaders to at least pick between. I mean, if we're to be honest and think about Leo Varadkar, Simon Harris, Ruth Coppinger, and ask ourselves, do either of the three of those people have a firm understanding of political philosophy? You don't have to be a philosopher, but an understanding of political philosophy is pretty fucking important. And I don't think either of the three of them could have a conversation with me for 5 or 10 minutes about equality. Now, that should worry anyone. So, firstly, and just real quick, I'll justify the rationale behind this because, if you want to join the military, if you're a professional football player and you want to join Man United or whatever, you're going to get a physical. They're going to review your games. There's going to be a lot of checking up going. There is a criteria. And it's probably no different with NASA or the NSA or big tech companies. They don't want just anyone who has a degree. They're looking for top of the class. And I suppose the point I'm making here is that these are just companies. When we're talking about a country, we're talking about decisions that affect the lives of millions. So I don't think it's unreasonable at all to basically regulate the quality of candidates we, the public, are being offered to vote on. So then the simple question is, well, who's qualified? A legal professional, an economist, a philosopher. I mean, if you had a doll full of philosophers, they're probably not going to handle the healthcare system that well. And if you have a doll full of legal professionals, they may not be able to work out the best template of equality to place over society. So with this, we're not going to find a one size fits all. But what we could do is pick a set of professions that we deem are relevant, and these can be used as one of the ways then that we determine eligibility. Like obviously, if you have a degree in economics or you are a legal professional or you've studied political philosophy, then it's a very good chance that your skill set is definitely needed in that team. Put it that way. But really, a degree is proof of knowledge. It's not proof that the person in question is a good decision maker, and it's not necessarily proof that they have the right disposition or that they're the right kind of person to be in leadership. And it's that exact same reasoning that I'd use to rule out just simply using an IQ test as well, because I don't believe that a high IQ is, innately indicative that you are perfectly configured for leadership. I don't think that's the case. So what I'm getting at is that in the future, I believe part of the criteria to be a candidate or to join a party should be that not only do you have to have one of these skills, but you should be subjected to a lot of testing, aptitude testing and the likes. Maybe even personality profiling, but definitely aptitude testing. I think pattern recognition and the ability to think abstractly, these are important things when we're looking at like macro situations like running countries. I mean, you could really argue that a new course needs to be created that all would-be politicians have to take, and this can be condensed. It can be a 2 year course or a 1 year course. I mean, let's be honest. If you're putting yourself in a position where you'd like to be involved in running a country, then teaching you some new skills shouldn't be that big of an ask. And just to double back for a second on the whole thing of the imposition of the few versus the imposition on the many. And I think one of the impositions on the many that people will be fairly happy to get behind would be education. I mean, I did CSP in school, and it was more like a general knowledge pop quiz of stupid things like who runs the UN. And I think most people would agree that secondary school is pretty bloated with information that we could definitely replace with something more useful. I mean, I really don't remember one time since I've left school where knowing how an oxbow lake was formed has benefited me. Whereas in this modern world where all this policy is being pushed, a little bit of intimate knowledge on equality might have actually benefited me a lot more. So, as most of us know, third level education needs to be majorly reshaped, but it's starting to look like both other levels need a good bit of attention too. And I feel pretty certain that just as their indoctrination had the results they wanted, if we put a good education system in place, we will see the results we want coming from it. And then we come to everything else we can do, basically. One thing I've seen said that I completely agree with is that A campaign promise should be basically considered a contract with the people. If you run on a promise, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to be pro life, and then you turn your back on that, well, let's just keep it broad and say you should be held accountable for that. Because it's one thing for a government to say something and they don't do it, and we just kick them out of government, which should definitely be the case. But there's a couple of politicians who ran on a stance, and then, it was 2.5, 3 years later, maybe then, when they went back on what they said they would stand for. And this might be a difficult system to figure out, but we can get there because obviously, for the whole term of 5 years, you can't hold someone to everything they said in front of the media because it is likely that maybe they're showing some new information, or it's easy for a politician to say that, but it does actually happen sometimes too that someone changes their view genuinely. So, but when it comes to running an election, there should be a set of core principles that we can at least expect politicians to not budge on that. I mean, if you're going into politics, there are a lot of issues that you should have a firm stance on, and you should be able to justify that and articulate that. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that if a person can't make up their mind on core issues, then there's a very good chance that they just don't belong in politics. Because if they can't form their own view, then essentially they will end up being manipulated by someone else's view. And I mean, again, it's one thing to be convinced and to maybe come around on a policy that you weren't sold on initially. But I'm talking about core principles here. I'm talking about things like whether you believe in nationalism or globalism, whether you believe in equality of opportunity or equality of outcome, whether you believe in mindless virtue signalling charity, or you believe in looking after Irish people first and not giving foreign aid away when we have a homeless crisis. And arguably another thing that would act like a controlling incentive here is that a pension needs to be earned. And I don't just mean by turning up, I mean by hitting standards. There should be parameters. The parameters should be relative to our current situation. But say, for example, unemployment and homelessness goes up too much, then forget a pension. You're disqualified from politics. Forget this attitude of, oh, maybe I'll try my luck again next cycle. I mean, I'm pretty sure most people agree that this career politician model is done, unless you're damn good at the job. And that's a reason why I wouldn't want to introduce term limits like they have in America, because I believe if we have someone who is good at the job and they're happy to stay there for 15 or 20 years, then we should let them. Assuming, of course, they can keep getting themselves voted back in. I do think there should be incentives too. Like we talked about with the parameters, I think that if a government manages to exceed expectations, then maybe there should be a reward for that. If you look at it like this, there's got to be an incentive. If there is no up or down for people in the Dáil to go, there's nothing to lose and nothing to gain. Well, then it really doesn't matter the level of your performance. You just keep turning up until you can be voted out. And like I said, when there's nothing to lose or gain, there's no incentive to do anything. And just I'd ask that just bear in mind that I'm talking systematically here. I wouldn't in a million years, like, they could end coronavirus tomorrow and I wouldn't give that shower of charlatans in the Dáil a bonus. But of course, I'm not really here to talk about them. I'm talking about democracy and the problems with it, basically. And the reason I'm speaking more loosely than anything is because democracy is, the system of it is different in a lot of different countries. And right here we have parish politics, obviously. And now I think that's fine for local elections. And I understand why we have it for general elections as well. I mean, it facilitates canvassing and voting. It'd be very hard if everyone in the country could vote for everyone. Well, then not only would the voters have a list of hundreds of candidates, but the candidates themselves would basically find themselves with the impossible task of trying to canvass and knock on the doors of the entire country. Even still, within this, there's still plenty we can do. I think a lot of Irish people are starting to share the feeling that it's high time we were afforded the opportunity to vote for our own leader. I've had enough of the leader of whatever party gets the most TDs as now the Taoiseach. And maybe we should think about a system where we're able to do that. And when we elect our Taoiseach then forms a cabinet of, let's say, maybe, I don't know, maybe like 35 to 60 elected TDs, as opposed to this just, a party being in power and we're all just subjected to that party's policies now and what it is they want. If they want a multicultural, quote unquote, heaven, well, then we have to live in that. Now, of course, cronyism could creep into that and he just elects everyone from his own party anyway, but of course we can control that with legislation. You know, we can say that no more than 40 of his elected cabinet members can be from his own party, or 40%, I mean. But just overall, I think we definitely deserve the right to appoint our own leader. I mean, I'm pretty sure we'd all agree that the presidency certainly is not electing our leader. That's really just a ceremonial position. Like, he or she will probably be never much more than a handshake, or again, unless we want to change that. And another point I'd make real quick is just basically around transparency. I'm not going off the deep end here and saying things are rigged, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with how easy it might be to rig an election here. The votes go from the voting centres to the counting centre in the back of a van, and we're supposed to just trust this. I'm starting to believe that this whole process should be on camera. Basically, we should be afforded the opportunity that if we want to watch this whole process happen, we can. We can watch the votes get loaded into the van, travel in the back of the van, get unloaded into the count centre, sit in the count centre under security all night long until the door is opened by counters. If I want to watch that whole process, that should be possible, both for transparency and for public confidence. Now, another quick point I'd make is that I do think we need to start thinking about raising the voting age. And there's a scientific argument behind that, but I won't get into it. Just for the minute, all I'll say is this: it would put a bit of distance between being straight out of indoctrination and having the right to vote. It would give people a few years in the working world to form their own opinions without, I suppose, what you might call the environmental echo chamber of third level education, which is definitely what it is these days. Because at the moment, the way it's working out is that people turn 18, they acquire the right to vote, they start voting. A lot of them will go to college, and basically, for the first few years, they have someone in their ear, telling them this is how you view the world, this is what's fair, this is what justice is. And they don't really have too much time on their own to think about what it is that they'd like to be voting for without this false dogma that's being pushed onto them. Because if we're to be honest, to a large extent, when you're in school, everything is still conceptual. And concepts like everyone who does the same job should be paid the same wage seem fair. Because you haven't got out into the working world yet. And you haven't been on a team with people where you realize that two people were lazy and you and the other guy had to pull all the weight on this team. And you start to really, you say to yourself, yeah, we are doing the same job, but I mean, I'm doing more work, so I believe I should be paid more, I'm worth more, or maybe you've more experience, or whatever it might be. So I think what I'm really saying is that it's hard to actually know what policies you believe in until you have experience with the effects that these policies would have. And unfortunately, when you're 18 and fresh out the door from school, I mean, a lot of us do start working at 15 or whatever we might start working at, but it's not a whole lot of experience. And the problem is referendums and elections are big issues. So I'm basically at the last 2 points I want to make here. And one of them is, I suppose, that if we didn't know it before, we certainly know it now, that democracy is no longer a standalone system. Like I talked about earlier, it involves education, and we know for sure that it involves the media. And to a large extent, it involves pop culture too, because we've seen already that unfortunately some people they idolize celebrities to the point that they would take their political advice on things like abortion or a general election or a presidential election or whatever it may be. And to be honest, I didn't think this video would go on this long at all. I didn't think it would take me this long to get through this, so I'll be short about this. But basically, we know the media monopolies need to be broken up. Things like NGOs that constantly peddle victimhood in everybody's face need to be defunded. Social media needs to be held accountable for the fact that they ban and shadow ban the opposition to any argument. And most of us have been on the receiving end of this, so we know for a fact that it's true. And it's fair to say that most of us know at this point that political control is the only reason that certain people had any interest whatsoever in trying to develop monopolies in certain industries because of the power it would yield. And the last point is a bit like the incentives. It just in that I'm thinking systematically and not specifically to right now. And the reason I say that is because with the level of indoctrination in society at the minute, this could well work against us. But I still think long term and with an eye towards the future, this is something that we should definitely consider. And this is the idea of devising a system that would allow the Irish people to, in a sense, impeach the government. Now, a lot of people would say that, if you're in the middle of something like an economic meltdown, the last thing you want to do is change the hands of power, but that's arguable. I mean, maybe getting rid of the people who brought you to that point is exactly what your priority is. And the reason I bring this up is because we can't rely on people in the Dáil to do it anymore. Because the whole idea behind it is that none of them want to rock the boat. They don't want to face another election. They want their little guaranteed post for a few years, and they'll sit there all expressing faux outrage at each other's policies and never really do anything. Because really, they all have a little reciprocal relationship. And if one party was to do that to another, well, then they'd live in fear that if they got in power, the party they did it to would come back and do it to them. So they all just play nice. And essentially, the Irish people get no justice. Now, a couple of ways this could work would one could be that, if let's say 60% of the population sign a petition, then that's it basically. And the government is disbanded and we're looking at a general election. And another way would be to use a parish politics approach and say any TD who receives a petition signed by more than 60% of the population in the area he was elected in now has to stand as a TD who has shown a motion of no confidence in the government. And that's a permanent thing if you've received that. And you can build them up. And the more areas that become disillusioned with the government, the more we stack up enough TDs to eventually call for a motion and pull them out. Now, ideally, this idea works best with the kind of cabinet idea I talked about earlier. Because if we elect the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach handpicks a cabinet from all parties, well, then no party really has an incentive to just recklessly agitate their supporters to basically bring about the end of a government that they have no guarantee that they'll have a better stake in after the next election. I wouldn't call for the end of parties because, parties organise and consolidate, they keep things active, and arguably, if everyone ran as an independent, it would be really just mayhem. But we do need to figure out a system that has a bit more meritocracy to it and a little less cronyism. That genuinely puts the best person for the job in the job rather than, oh, well, but I have a guy in my party who can do that job. But I'm going to start wrapping it up because I didn't intend for it to be this long. And really, from one person in a short amount of time, there were never going to be final answers. But, it's clear that it needs a major overhaul. The strange truth is that you basically need nothing to run for an election here. And I think we're finding out the hard way that that's definitely not how it should be. And democracy was always meant to mean that anyone could run. And they still can. Just you're going to have to prove that you are competent and capable of the job, or at least have acquired a degree or skill set that's relevant. Nobody should get elected just because they were likable and because they had a fine campaign behind them that put them everywhere and they were on every morning show and radio channel. Like I said earlier, we're talking about a country here. We're talking about the lives of millions of people. It shouldn't just be an open door for any old Egypt to walk through. And before I really do just go off on a total tangent, I'm going to wrap it up here. So, Toga Bugay, agus fecha mé sivaríis.